Now let's consider occultism. Most Christians would say that they didn't agree with it, and probably that this view was consistent with the Bible. However, I've yet to see the word occult or occultism in any translation of the English Bible. Most of what we think we know about occultism has surprisingly recent and certainly post-biblical roots. Kabalism is thought to have started in the 13th century. Traditional ideas about witches having sex with Satan come from the Malleus Maleficarum, which had appallingly bad scholarship and was published in 1486. Much of ideas about occultism per se can be traced to Eliphas Levi, who lived in the 19th century. Wicca was basically made up by British civil servants in the 1950s. If you look at the Wikipedia entry on occultism, it talks about the difficulty in defining it, and it can be argued that any religious ideas which aren't claimed by a major religion can be considered occult. There are words in most, probably all English Bibles that are thought to relate to the occult: witch, sorcerer, astrologer, and so forth. The trouble is that most of these words are rather vague in English. It's also doubtful that Bible translators were well versed in occult terminology, and there's some question about if words in the original language are understood by anybody. Obviously, what we really want to know is what the Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek words mean. The trouble is that none of these terms are defined in the Bible. There's a story about a medium calling up a spirit of a dead prophet, but was that the defining function of mediums, or the reason God condemned them? The fact that Jesus spoke to Moses at the Transfiguration suggests that the law is more complicated than simply don't speak to dead people. Isaiah describes astrologers as stargazers who predict the future month by month. Were these significantly different from modern astrologers? Anyway, the word translated as astrologers only appears once in the Bible. A different word is translated as astrologers in Daniel, and they're not really condemned. It just says they won't be able to save Babylon. The other words are even less clear. In the King James Bible, you'll find condemnations of observers of times. Who thinks it's important to do certain things at certain times? Jews. I think this is an attempt to inject anti-Semitism into the Old Testament. As far as I can tell, there's absolutely no basis for the translation observers of times. The literal meaning of the Hebrew word is more like bringers. What does this mean? Summoners of spirits, or people who provided drugs, or prostitutes, or something else? Providing drugs or prostitutes is bad, but it isn't something we'd consider to be occult. Other majors make their meaning clear. I've yet to find any. I think the result of this is that Christians tend to be rather paranoid about anything that looks vaguely occult. Obviously, anything that involves worshipping another god, extramarital sex, homosexual relationships, bestiality, or human sacrifice is wrong. We don't need a definition of occult to know that. Some other things like dancing around naked, using mind-altering drugs and animal sacrifices seem rather questionable, but you may have problems constructing a biblical argument against them. However, there are some things that Christians tend to think of as occult that involve none of these things and don't seem to be specifically condemned in the Bible. Yoga, acupuncture, telepathy, dowsing, etc. I don't know a good way to clarify the situation with these things. Telepathy is hard to condemn, as Jesus seems to use it, but most Christians ignore this. Numerology is hard to condemn because the Bible seems to give it some credence, with many cases of particular numbers seem no special significance. How many things come in 12s or 40s? What about 666? For this subject, the type of occultism we're mainly concerned with is Kabalism, which is usually defined as Jewish occultism. If you read The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, which is a non-fiction book that probably inspired the Da Vinci Code, and its authors actually tried to sue Dan Brown for plagiarism, you'd find that it describes the Priory of Zion as a Hermetic order, but oddly enough never explains Hermeticism. Well, Hermeticism is usually defined as non-Jewish Kabbalism, but that's perhaps a bit overly simplistic. Anyway, that's how Kabalism fits in here. Kabbalism's occult, so presumably it's bad, but does it fit the biblical definition of occultism? Which you don't know. It's Jewish, so it has some sort of familial relationship with Christianity, but does that mean it's good? It's generally thought to have started in the 13th century, but one of its main texts, the Zohar, is supposed to be written in the 2nd century, buried and accidentally rediscovered in the 13th century. If this is true, then it may at least have value in understanding Jewish mysticism at around the time of Jesus, and could potentially give us insights into his teachings. Scholars seem to think that the Zohar fits in stylistically with 13th century writings, including its origin story is bogus. However, this story is similar to what happened with the Dead Sea Scrolls, so it's plausible. Does the Bible say anything about Kabalism? Well, this is weird. It's going to be a bit of a digression. 2 Tim 4:9-13 reads, "Do your best to come to me soon, for Demas, because he has fallen in love with this present world, has deserted me and gone off to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia. Titus has gone to Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. Take Mark and bring him with you, because he is a very useful helper in my work. But Titius I have sent to Ephesus. When you come, bring the coats which are left with Carpus in Troas, also the scrolls and especially the parchments." You probably know that the Gospels of Matthew and Luke are thought to have been based on Mark's Gospel and another common source known as Q. Well, here Paul's got Luke with him. He's asking for Mark and some documents to be brought to him. I suspect there are 2 longer synoptic Gospels written as a result of this meeting, and it may also have resulted in a longer ending being added to Mark. This means that these authors may have colluded, and the differences between the Gospels may be some sort of hidden code. Then God could just have inspired the authors to hide a hidden code without knowing about it. Now, let's look at the 2 genealogies of Jesus in Matthew's and Luke's Gospels. They seem to be contradictory. Matthew's is in chronological order, while Luke is in reverse chronological order. Let's see what happens when you draw a chart of them, with the bits that are only in Matthew on one side, the bits only Luke in the other, and the bits that they agree on in the middle. The generations from God to Terah are only in Luke. The generations from Abraham to David are in both. Matthew does what you'd expect and basically lists the kings of Judah from Solomon to Jehoiachin, although he misses a few. Luke bizarrely lists what is presumably the house of Nathan. He has Nathan, Solomon's brother, another son of David and Bathsheba, and then a list of people who don't seem to be mentioned elsewhere in the Bible, except for the odd passing reference to the house of Nathan. Next, both books agree on Shealtiel and Zerubbabel, which is a bit odd because Zerubbabel was Shealtiel's grandson, so they both miss the same generation. Then they both have different lists of people who aren't mentioned elsewhere in the Bible. Lastly, they both agree on Joseph, which is also odd as it's clear that neither author believes him to be Jesus' biological father. Let's look at what we've got. If we consider the number of generations in each section, it also seems to form a pattern. We have 2 14s and another multiple of 7. Matthew talks about groups of 14 generations, but he lumps the last 3 sections of his genealogy together, but there are only 13 generations in them. Hebrew letters can also be used to represent numbers. Does this mean anything? The 2 upper sections that are only found in Luke contain in the sequence Joseph something something Levi Mathat, and end with similar sounding names Heri and Nelly. Neri and Heli. I don't claim to know what this means, but it's definitely strange and probably intentional. Does this pattern remind you of anything? This is the Kabbalistic tree of life, which is central to Kabalism. There are a number of variations on it, most of only 10 circles or sephiroth, to use the technical term. They're supposed to represent emanations of God. Some have an 11th, so I've faded that one. Let's assume that Tree of Life was based on the genealogies of Jesus. Well, straight off, this would seem to fit in with the whole Priory of Zion protecting descendants of Jesus thing, although I don't believe that. Perhaps they're really protecting descendants of one or more of Jesus' siblings, which may explain why Joseph is in these genealogies. That would mean that the writers of Luke and Matthew must have envisioned or prophesied descendants of Joseph being important. Perhaps this symbolises some sort of formula for breeding the Messiah by repeatedly interbreeding 2 groups of people. Let's run with that and assume that the Tree of Life also symbolises this sort of formula. Then presumably what the Tree of Life is saying is, oh, messed up there with Jesus, let's try again sometime later. This makes perfect sense to mainstream Jews. Have you ever tried this and what was the result? Well, there have been a number of Jewish false messiahs and none ended well. Ridiculous? Well, let's take a look at the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail. Talking about the death of Berenger Sunnier, the controversial priest of Rennes-le-Château. No, the following morning his body was placed upright in an armchair on the terrace of the Tor Magdala, clad in an ornate robe with scarlet tassels. One by one certain unidentified mourners filed past, many of them plucking tassels of remembrance from the dead man's garment. There has never been an explanation for this ceremony. This seems to have mystified Michael Bajan to Richard Lee and Henry Lincoln, but it sounds like a variation on the Jewish ritual of removing the tassels or tzitzit from the body of a dead Jew. Was Sunnier a Jew? He was a Catholic priest. That might explain why he put a sign saying "This place is terrible" over the entrance to his church, and the priest who heard his deathbed confession refused to absolve him and reputedly never smiled again. Perhaps more likely he belonged to some sort of quasi-Jewish sect or secret society, which is exactly what the conspiracy theorists claim. But oddly, the authors on the best-known book on the subject completely miss the connection here. Anyway, I guess the point is that Kabalism may be derived from some esoteric beliefs held by early Christians, including the writers of the Synoptic Gospels, although it seems to have been corrupted to reject Jesus as the Messiah in accordance with mainstream Judaism. Is there a baby in there which can be saved if you throw out the anti-Jesus bathwater? Well, I have to believe that these esoteric beliefs were alluded to in the Bible because they're of some importance.